So,
Well, there were two statesmen who dominated the 19th century, and one of them was, not the 19th century, 20th. Churchill is seen, I think rightly, by the great majority of the British people as the man who won the war. Now, that was our war. It was that very small period of time when Britain literally stood alone, where Holland, Belgium had all been occupied, Paris was occupied, France fell, America was still not coming into the war, Russia was still linked in with Germany through the Ribbentrop agreement. And so it was a moment really when we were alone, and we had to decide to fight. And the Foreign Secretary Halifax had been urging the cabinet, the war cabinet of 6 people, that we should open negotiations with Mussolini. And Churchill knew that if you opened negotiations with Mussolini, you were really negotiating with Churchill. And Churchill would have been faced by a demand from Mussolini and from Hitler to have a ceasefire. And once he'd had a ceasefire, with Germany ensconced across the Channel in possession of France, we would have been toast. We would have been destroyed. It would have been the most humiliating defeat possible. So he had to defeat by argument and by passion, with the help of every other member of the War Cabinet, the proposition from the Foreign Secretary, who could have been Prime Minister, and who the previous Prime Minister, Chamberlain, wanted Lord Halifax to be Prime Minister. And he did it by the power of argument and debate. So one of the finest examples of cabinet government, collective responsibility, and argument and open debate and coming to a conclusion. And the conclusion was we would fight, and we would fight alone. And the Chiefs of Staff had said we were not likely to be invaded. The greatest danger was that we would be bombed to defeat, and that everything would rest on whether we could build enough Hurricane planes and Spitfires before the summer. And they predicted at this meeting that the battle that was going to be the crucial one was in the air, and eventually it was the Battle of Britain. It was in the air. But that was why Churchill's funeral was something very special. There wasn't a person. They may well have voted in 1945 him out. And remember, he was defeated by an overwhelming Labour victory, and his deputy in the coalition cabinet, Attlee, became Prime Minister. So it didn't matter where you were in the political spectrum. You all knew that we owed our way of life, which had continued really unchanged. I knew that even as a young, I was born in 1938, but I was brought up during the war. I had no father. I came to the end of the war in 1945, and a man came in with my mother to take me out from school, and with a moustache, and I'd never seen a picture of my father with a moustache. I walked up to him and shook his hand and said, "Good afternoon, sir." That was my father, been out fighting in, first of all, in the British Expeditionary Force, then fighting in North Africa, and then ending his war really in Italy. Now, you don't, even my generation, I feel I was at war. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the radio with the news, and if you made a noise, if you dropped an apple or you kicked a ball, that was really frowned on. And my mother was listening, hoping to catch where my father might be, where he was in the war, what was happening in either in France or in Belgium or in later on in North Africa.
Close to funeral, what details of Winston Churchill's funeral can be highlighted? Many say that this is the only Englishman who was not have a monarch blood, but he was buried as a monarch.
He was, in a way, buried as a monarch. Yes, he lay in state in Westminster Hall, and I remember going in and queuing up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was at St Thomas's Hospital across the way, and I went there, and I think it was still 2:30. I was still working in the hospital And we just decided to cross the bridge and queue up and go around his catalogue in Westminster Hall. Then you watch on television. This is one of the first real big events that most of us had television, only black and white, not colour, from what I remember. And then there's this fantastic shot of his coffin carried by a boat up the Thames, and he passes these cranes in the East End of London, and the crane drivers dip the crane, and then like you would sort of tip your hat or take your hat off. It's a fantastic shot, really. And it captured everything about him, really. I think it captured the spirit that here was the East End of London bombed to hell during the war, and here were the dockers, traditionally on the left, Labour voters, but they knew that they owed their way of life to this chap.
It is known that Queen Elizabeth II is even present at his funeral, which is canonically wrong. Is it so?
The Queen came to the funeral. I think it's a voluntary thing whether the Queen comes to funerals. She occasionally does, but they're usually people who are family or very close friends. But yeah, I think there was never any question that she would be there. She was his first Prime Minister, so when she was a young Queen, he was still just Prime Minister. So he used to call himself, I was your first Prime Minister, ma'am. She said, yes, I know. So she learnt from him, but he was getting old by then. Yeah, he really ought to have retired earlier.
Churchill began to prepare for the death long before death, for the funeral. Everyone knew that the famous British Prime Minister leads a very unhealthy lifestyle, and he died at the age of 90 without parting with cognac and cigars.
Well, cognac may have increased his circulation in the blood. His cigarette, it was almost always he didn't smoke cigarettes. And people don't usually inhale quite as much from a cigar. I suspect he smoked so much that the room was full of cigar smoke. No, I mean, he was a bon vivant. He had a very strange sleeping habits. He'd sleep off until sort of 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the morning, but he wouldn't go to bed until about 4:30. And he'd keep up the generals during the war. And these guys, he used to forget, they had to be on parade more or less at 6 o'clock. They barely get any sleep. And no, he was a remarkable man, and he was also a brilliant writer. He wrote the history of the Second World War, and we're now having to correct it because a lot of it was to make light of the issues which were really quite big, and he didn't want to highlight. No, he's a great Englishman, there's no doubt about that.
It was known there was whole operation, which is the name We Hope Not, for preparing for funerals, and for long time, and in strictest secrecy atmosphere.
Well, they have a plan now for the death of Queen Elizabeth II. After all, Queen Elizabeth I was a great ruler, and we were, of course, a great country in those days. Armada and the beating of the Spaniards. No, I think you'll find that there'll never be another political figure who will have a funeral like his.
Yeah.
Better go there.
Yeah, you can go.
It's important to say, not only was the Queen there, but Clement Attlee, who became Prime Minister after Churchill in 1945, but he'd been his deputy as a Labour in a coalition all through his Prime Ministership, and was a crucial figure, was also there, and he died a year later, or a couple of years later. So you had the Queen representing her father, who was extremely important, George VI, during the war, and there was the other leader of the opposition, but Deputy Prime Minister there at his funeral. And the continuity of that is a reminder, you know, that we have had a political system where you've been able to work very effectively across the party political divide, and particularly in both world wars, in the First World War with Lloyd George and the Conservative supporting him, and
25 million British and over 350 million people around the world watched the ceremony of the Churchill funeral, and the American television audience, as I have said here, was bigger than the funeral of John Kennedy 2 years earlier. What do you think? So why is Churchill so loved in America as well?
I think he was by then loved. You know, I mean, he was a controversial politician, and in various parts of the country did things which people didn't like. And the Welsh had considerable reservations when he was Home Secretary, and when they believed that he used the troops. It was slightly mythology, but there was the possibility of that being used. But he was not universally popular. But for a war, as I say, brings people together. A war, there is no party politics, and I think he was loved by many people. I mean, I can only remember my mother, you know, who died at the age of 92, and she used to say to me, "Never did I ever think we were going to lose the war." Well, that's an extraordinary when you think of it. I mean, Plymouth was flattened by bombs. We were bombed out of Plymouth, we were bombed out of Newport, and my father was away. All this time, this woman bringing up her children, acting as dentist, never believed that we could lose. Well, I mean, there were ample opportunities for believing we were going to be defeated. And I think this is Churchill's strength. These speeches he made and his radio talks, he never gave the impression that there was the slightest chance that we would be defeated. And it is unbelievable, really, when you read, there they were, you know, in Calais. So I think that you have to say that there was more than just a very clever and powerful politician, and more than a man who had studied war and had alerted the country to the dangers of Hitler. There was a man who could communicate to women who didn't know much about these issues confidence. We are going to win this war.
They say that the condition for Charles de Gaulle presence at the funeral was that the body of the Churchill it would be delivered from Waterloo. And also after the funeral de Gaulle said, now Britain is no longer a great power. What do you think?
I don't think de Gaulle had the slightest thing to do with where the body, that was planned for years in advance before de Gaulle had even come back into politics. Remember, he went off out of French politics for many years and lived almost a sign of exile in Colombe des Églises. Well, I have a lot of time for Churchill. I have a lot of time for de Gaulle, and I think that he was hugely important, and Churchill understood that. He was an infuriating man and almost impossible to deal with. At various times, Churchill got exasperated and angry with him. Funnily enough, he had a very bad relationship with President Roosevelt, who never trusted de Gaulle and didn't like him as a man. So his influence on events was pretty marginal, and of course he was never allowed to come to the Potsdam. I think he resented that a bit. But you know, there are a lot of myths of the war. There's a slight myth about the French resistance, and there's certainly a myth about the contribution that France made to the Second World War. But we were real allies in the First World War, and they bore the brunt of it, and they had the greatest casualties.
US President Lyndon Johnson was accused of not coming on the grounds that he had a cold. What do you think, reasonably?
LBJ was his own man, a very strange figure. I don't know why he didn't come. He didn't, I think, visit the UK at any time during his presidency. he was probably the most all-American of the presidents that I can remember in my lifetime. I think he was basically a creature of the Senate, and he was the leader of the Senate. And I think he saw power, he represented power in the Senate. He was a great figure, really. But remember, the Vietnam War was running hard. No, it hadn't really. Well, it was not true. He was beginning to be. He was obsessed about the Vietnam War by that stage, and so the funeral. I don't know. I really don't like to give any imagery of it. I don't know the facts. Most American presidents have been admirers of Churchill and have wanted to have some symbol or photograph of him around in the White House, most of them. But I think we trade off that relationship. It was not even all that easy between Roosevelt and Churchill. There was a lot of difficulties. They worked together well, but certainly once America came into the war, Churchill knew we'd win. Up until then, I think he had profound questions about whether we could win, even though giving the impression to everybody that we would win. And then I think in 1943, America really began to take control of events, and they were the most powerful relationship. And Churchill was quite jealous of Roosevelt's relationship with Stalin, and was always a bit nervous that Stalin would only switch into him. So he went to see Stalin during the war. They had a very important meeting, actually, during the war, a bilateral meeting, which I think Roosevelt was not too happy about.
Churchill initially wanted to be cremated and buried next to his pets. But however, then he changed his mind, and now he lies where he lies. And why do you think he changed his mind?
I suspect he knew that really he should return to the village nearest to Blenheim and return to being, you know, a descendant of the greatest General Marlborough. So I think history told him. I think the idea of lying in a village churchyard in Bladen was attractive to him. I think when you die, often people prefer to go back to your roots. He was born in Blenheim, and I think that, I mean, he loved Chartwell. He could have been buried in the grounds of Chartwell. But I think that it was almost he believed he belonged to history, and that therefore he wrote a very good book on Marlborough, and I think he was a conservative, remember, and conservatives like tradition and following historical patterns. I'm certain he wanted that funeral. And it was interesting, it was in St. Paul's, because of course St. Paul's is much bigger and it can take a very large crowd, and it was again being in the city. I think it was all judged very well, the funeral, very well.
British society now?
I think people are interested in the history of the Second World War, where it differs from Churchill's. And I think people do realise that we were rather conned into a very Churchillian view. I mean, he said he would write the history of the Second World War, which he did. And in those days, you couldn't get even hold of the documents. So for a long time, he had written in his books that never, in the whole history of the war, had the issue of making a negotiation for peace had ever been on the agenda of the War Cabinet. Strictly speaking, that was true, because the War Cabinet had no agenda, but it was discussed over 8 meetings whether or not to do, as I have said, about talking to Mussolini. And it was as if he didn't want, the book was published, the first memoir that touched on that was published in about 1948, I think, 49. And he was warming up to a general election. And his image at the general election in 50, which he lost, and in 51, which he won, was the man who was absolutely invincible, resolute, never contemplated anything like defeat or negotiation, but only absolute victory. And he didn't want to tarnish that impression. Also, when you start to write history, you know, I find this myself, you forget slightly. You gild the lily. You remember only things where you come out rather well. You have a tendency to forget things which you don't come out quite so well. And he was victim to that as well. But there are still magnificent history books, and nobody can write about the Second World War. I wrote one book about Churchill's cabinet as an example of the virtues of cabinet government in 1940. And you can't write about that without coming away from it, once again, with a reinforced view that here was a very great man and a very wise man. And of course he had huge faults, but he had huge pluses. He was a big man. They all were. Stalin was a very remarkable figure, you know. There's absolutely no doubt whatever about that. And I've never forgotten being driven in from the airport with Gromyko into Moscow, and these big metal crosses that were at the point where the German forces were in the suburbs of Moscow. And Gromyko said to me, "You think I am too soft on what we then used to call MBFR, mutual and balanced force reductions. You want me to make more concessions. Just remember, this is why I'm very cautious." Everybody in Russia is cautious. Because of that, we nearly lost Moscow.
It's true. Like Churchill was buried in a royal scale. The Queen was also them. Didn't appear for long, but was. What do you think so? Why do you think that respect was expressed to Thatcher after all, as they say, she was a figure more than controversial?
Well, she was the first woman Prime Minister, but more than that, she was Prime Minister for a long period of time, and she won 3 elections. One of those was the one that she came to power, and I was in the Callaghan government, and we were ousted by her. I think it was never quite like Churchill's. She was not, she did not lie in state in Westminster Abbey, and some people thought it should do. It was never a state funeral. It was slightly short of it. I think that, once again, the Queen got it right. She would have made all the key controversial decisions. And I think the decision was she shouldn't be put on a pedestal with Churchill. He should be allowed to be there by himself. There was nobody else who had a state funeral of that size, of that magnitude, and that she didn't deserve that. But if you go into the House of Commons, and in the members' lobby, just outside the chamber of the House of Commons, there are 4 pedestals, and as you go in through, there's the little bit that is left of the arch after the bomb when the House of Commons was destroyed during the war. And on each side of that are the 2 great war leaders, Churchill and David Lloyd George. I'm Welsh, so I think Lloyd George as a war leader was every bit the match of Churchill. And then on the other 2, as you go into the chamber, there's Attlee, because he played such a big part in the Second World War and was the first Labour Prime Minister with a long period in office and a great record. And there was this empty pedestal during most of the time I was an MP. And very few of us doubted, after she was in for second, third time, that the right person to go on that pedestal would be Thatcher. And after she died, and after a suitable interval, we take some time of this, that is what happens. And that is now, in the members, you've got Lloyd George, Churchill, Attlee, and Thatcher. And that was by consent of the House of Commons, so it couldn't happen if the Labour Party and the Liberal Party hadn't agreed to it. And I think that though some people begrudge that status for her, fewer and fewer people do. I think we do see that she and Attlee were the two great post-war prime ministers, and the two great wartime prime ministers were Lloyd George and Churchill. And I doubt anybody will ever want to fill. There are one other pedestal there. I'm sure Blair one time thought he would be there, but I don't think he would be there. I doubt we'll ever fill that.
It is known that the Iron Lady was preparing for her death for a long time, and she herself clearly prescribed the details of the funeral. Do you think that Thatcher was preparing for her death?
Well, remember, she was forced out. This is what many people need to remember about democratic politics. She stayed too long, and she was eventually forced out. Under our system, you are made prime minister by your political party, and if you lose control of your political party, they can oust you. And so the cabinet turned against her and the members of parliament, and she lost the leadership. She didn't actually lose the vote, but it was perfectly clear after the first round with Michael Heseltine that she would lose and others would come in. And of course, John Major came in and was the sort of candidate to both continue her legacy, as people thought, and not allow Heseltine in, who had rocked the boat and threatened her. It was for many Conservative MPs, her funeral was not the first time that they'd had a funeral. The first funeral was when she was removed from office, and they referred to it as an assassination. They saw her as being assassinated. That's a tough word. They never really accepted the removal by the forces around Heseltine. Major is now pretty clearly was complicit in the plot to get rid of her, and the true Thatcherites think even today that she was assassinated by her party when she was removed democratically. A slight difference.
According to the scenario of the funeral of Thatcher, ordinary people should not be allowed to attend the funeral. But some people even celebrated her death and claimed the witch has finally died and turned their backs to the procession as a disrespect. What do you think? The British woman Prime Minister had a mutual dislike with the common people.
Well, her death was not as long after he gave up as Churchill. You know, she was. There were still more memories of her, and she was also a more divisive figure than Churchill. But there were people who disliked Churchill. Very few major political leaders in a democracy don't leave behind a relic of people who hate them and dislike them, and you have to recognize that. And I think that Churchill had his enemies, but by then those enemies either died off. If you die at the age of 90, you know, most of the people who are contemporaries who don't dislike you have probably died first. So I think there's a bit of that about it, but he didn't have, she was, I mean, the Falklands, some people call it a war, but actually it was never officially a war. It was a dispute, but she did bind the country together pretty well during the Falklands War, and she showed a side of her character which many people doubted existed. She was not totally invincible personally. She was very upset at various times, losing warships, losing people's lives, and she wasn't utterly confident that we could retake the Falklands. It was a very difficult military operation to retake an island from the sea, particularly one as many miles away as we were. It was a very hazardous, and we didn't have control of the air, and the Argentinian had this French superentendard missile system, and they were pretty effective. So it was a close-run thing, the Falklands War. And I think, though, that did expand her appeal. I think people after the Falklands War had a certain measure of treating her differently. It was she had shown that she could do that hardest thing and speak for the whole country at a time of war. So, but even so, she persuaded, or was persuaded by, I don't know, but they held a military march past in the City of London with the mayor of Lord Mayor of London. The Queen should have taken that march past, and I think the Queen thought so too. And that was Thatcher and her supporters going above themselves. And I mean, the whole idea of the monarchy is that it's Her Majesty's forces, and it used to always be referred to as Her Majesty's government. And when I was foreign minister, you never talked about our government or my government. It was Her Majesty's government. And HMG was the disposal. That did begin to change a bit under Thatcher, and she was quite keen on talking about my government. Yeah, she was more of a flawed personality than Churchill. There wasn't the same generosity of spirit. He was very good about. I mean, he accepted defeat in 1945 and came back and had to go back on the opposition benches and stand there and still lose in 50. So he fought in 45 and lost overwhelmingly, fought in 1950. It was close, but he didn't get into it. And only in 51 did he win. And even then, Labour had more votes than the Conservative votes. So Churchill was able to be a very great House of Commons man. He never wanted to go to the House of Lords. He'd made too many people Lords. He knew the Lords were a ridiculous place. And he stayed in the House of Commons, and he was tolerated even though he was very old for many, many years.
About society,
well, again, you can't compare the two in a way. I mean, Churchill had liberated France, he liberated Belgium, had liberated the Netherlands, and then had come in as a conquering army, and we had Berlin was split into 4 parts, and the Soviet Union had one part, Russia one part. France, Britain insisted should have one sector, and then there was the British sector. And so the US sector. So the 4 powers ran Berlin for a long period of time, really until the Berlin Wall fell in '89. So there was a real relationship to these countries because of the war. And Netherlands, in particular, very fond of Churchill, and Thatcher had been seen as having really been a pre-runner of Brexit. Who knows what she would have done in Brexit, but in my view, she would have been a Brexiteer. We can argue about that. But she had carved out a role of criticism of the EU, and there were many areas where she had been in advance of public opinion. Without Thatcher's scepticism about many aspects of the European Union, I suspect we'd still be in it.
Why not the huge delegation around the world coming for the funeral? Even delegation from Russia was very small. Even friend Thatcher Gorbachev just referred to poor health.
Well, Russia and we had been allies in the war. You know, Stalin was part of the Allied forces. We talked about each other. He was always pushing us to open up a second front. He wanted us really to try and cross the channel in 1941, then 42, 43. But he wrote a wonderful letter. It's only just recently been revealed to Churchill about the success of the invasion of D-Day. And it is clear that he understood all along what a monumental task it was to defeat the Germans on the beaches with their guns looking down on the beaches and everything like that. And it's a wonderfully generous letter, Stalin's, and it has literally only been seen in Britain in the last few years. And it's as if he knew that he was trying it on, really, to persuade us to go in 42 or 43, that we needed a time to build up these forces. This was quite different from some of his great victories against Germany on the land mass of Europe, to actually cross that tricky waters of the Channel and have everything he understood. So I think that, you know, Russia, I mean, I know about the Atlantic convoy, and my Russian business partner, Alisha Usmanov, is immensely involved with Archangel, and he would pay for British people who were on the Atlantic convoy to be there and represented in Murmansk when the Atlantic convoy was celebrated. Now, the Atlantic convoy, people don't realize, but it was Churchill who, against the advice of the admirals, we were having huge casualties. We couldn't stop. The Germans were sitting in Norway with their airfields, able to bomb this convoy that would try and relieve you. And Stalin was all the time asking for more, as he was every right to do, more ammunition, more tanks, more food. And it was one of the great achievements of Churchill that, despite the fact that we were short of all these things ourselves, not least food, that we provided it for Russia during that period of time.
I just want to ask, about the Thatcher funerals. What other details can be remembered? For example, her body wasn't put on public display for fear of vandalism.
No, that's nonsense. That was the reason was on public display would have been that she would have been in the catalogue in Westminster Hall, and that's what Churchill had done. That was a symbol of a state funeral, which previously had been monarchs and one major prime minister other than Churchill. And so I think the decision was rightly taken that Thatcher was not of that unique quality, and that she was not going to, she was allowed to have her coffin taken into the crypt of the House of Commons, and if anybody in the House of Commons wanted to signify their affection or respect for her, they could go and see the coffin before it went to the church. But she was deprived of that, but it was not because it would have been molested. For goodness sake, in Westminster Hall, you wouldn't have any difficulty. The civilians walked around, but it was guarded by Prince Charles, and the royal family were there with swords. No, there was no, that's not true. There were certain reservations, you're right. There were a few little demonstrations in the great crowds that lined the road, but they were very minor. We shouldn't exaggerate them. They were there. But she was a more controversial figure all her political life than Churchill. And she was more of a Tory. Churchill was a liberal, remember. He was conservative first, then he was liberal. He was, he held powerful positions as liberal, and then he became a conservative. So he spanned the political, bit like me, had more than one political party. And, but she had only one political party, and that was the Tory. And she was a very fervent Tory. He was not a Tory in that sense. We use the word Tory, those of us on the left, slightly to signify that there was not that breadth of feeling of some other conservative leaders.
The last question, what is the attitude of the Thatcher of British society now?
Well, like everything, when people die, you usually forget the bad parts more than the good parts, and the good parts remain. But she is still in parts of the country in the north of England where the mining industry took place. The miners' strike was a great clash in which I think she was on the right, not the miners, but they would vehemently deny that. But where she was in the wrong is she did precious little to bring industry and help the people of the mining communities. And these were often small villages. They were difficult to help, but we didn't do enough for the mining community. We didn't need the coal any longer. We were relying on oil and gas. We moved out of coal naturally and correctly. It's not a nice life sending people down into coal mines, getting pneumoconiosis and a lot of other illnesses. But she was insensitive. That was the real problem, Margaret Thatcher. And she was insensitive to the ongoing problems of the mining villages that had to close and had felt victims of the miners' strike. So there was a great deal of bitterness about her role in holding out and defeating Arthur Scargill, who was a communist. And he deserved to be defeated, but she was insensitive in the aftermath, and that was one of her weaknesses, to be honest. She was always insensitive on these type of political questions. She was a Tory. There was a harshness to her political beliefs. There was not much softening of it. But it was a necessary battle, and you didn't dare let Scargill win that battle. And I think that a lot of our subsequent changes and prosperity owed the fact that the trade unions were told in no uncertain terms that they were not going to control the country. The two previous miners' strikes, they had in effect won. But this one, she had foreseen it, collected big coal deposits around the electricity generating plants. And so she ensured a defeat for the miners, and that was harsh. And in defeat, she didn't do enough to soften the blow. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Areas where the politicians will have to grow up, both on our side and on theirs. And I say, I'm old enough, I've seen it all before. This is talk. We will come to a resolution of this issue. And, you know, outside they face much greater threats. I mean, America is not going to go on accepting European cars coming into America, and they pay only 6%, and they charge American cars in Europe 10%. Not going to happen. And there are going to be big changes taking place in the whole of this area, and rational men and women will resolve it, in my view. But don't underrate the British people. On the referendum, they don't like referendums, it was the sort of thing, and people said, oh, it was a little there. They then watched their government completely unable to make any decisions for 3 bloody years. Yeah. And they got angry. They weren't even allowed an election. Eventually an election came, they've shown it clearly. And Boris Johnson has got 80 majority in the House of Commons. He can do exactly what he likes, and all the signs are that he will have a limit of how much he'll put up with from the EU, and if they want to create a lot of problems, he'll walk away. And yes, there'll be problems for a little while, but as far as medicine is concerned, no. We've got 2 big pharmaceutical manufacturers. We'll just tell them, lift the patents, it's a law, and you can manufacture any drug you like that it's been we're held in ransom to. But we only have to go to America and buy all those drugs from them. You know, there's a thing called plain. I mean, you can bring a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. I was on the board of one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Abbott Laboratories in Chicago, for 15 years. I was Minister of Health for 2.5 years. Don't tell me we're going to have trouble with drugs. We may have a lot of trouble with other things, but we're not going to have trouble with that. There'll be some queues, there'll be some cursing and swearing and everything like that. But the British people have made up their mind, and we are a determined race when it comes down to it. We'll come, and we'll gather in the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish on it. We're a different country now. We've resolved this issue. It took us a long time, but we resolved it.
Yeah, I just...
Boris Johnson has his faults, but I mean, he's experienced political leader. London is a difficult city to be the mayor of. He's been the mayor himself. You know.
Really?
Yes. Yes. We almost all do have. But this is about all these various American presidents. Now, look at that emaciated face. He was sick with Addison's disease.
Which?
This is John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, which disease?
This Addison's disease. It affects the adrenal glands that sits on your kidneys. And he had the last rites given to him as a Catholic on Queen Mary, going back on a cross from London where he'd been diagnosed with it He very nearly died twice, Kennedy. And there's Kennedy with these. He's like Roosevelt. You never saw Roosevelt in a wheelchair. You practically never saw him on crutches. And that's after his bad back. There's Kennedy with Khrushchev.
Oh, show me Khrushchev.
Yeah. Very important meeting. He was hopeless at this meeting, and probably he'd had a intravenous injection of amphetamines, and it's a drug, and you go on a high and then you go on a low. Khrushchev arrived late. Khrushchev underestimated this man, and after this meeting, this was in Vienna in 1960, a year later, he put nuclear weapons in Cuba, and then in 62 they had this face-off. That's a very important figure. There's Kennedy again, looking young and vigorous. There's Mitterrand, famous picture of Mitterrand and Kohl, hand in hand. Saddam Hussein just about to be executed by hanging. And this is this famous speech in which he said, you see, mission accomplished. And this was when the battle was raging in Baghdad in 2003, far from being accomplished. There's Pol Pot. Who are the Russians? Probably some more. There you are. There's Yeltsin. Good old Yeltsin. That was in the election. Now, what because his heart was in very bad nick. What they gave him to make him dance there, it was an amazing picture. But he was acquitted. His heart was in really serious trouble at that time. And this is a picture of me, this young man here. It's me as foreign minister.
No way.
And there's Brezhnev, and there's Gromyko. So when you talk to me, I've negotiated with Gromyko. I liked actually Gromyko.
Unbelievable. Yeah, she was quite clever.
When we went we were foreign minister. This is September 77. I went to October 77. And we didn't know how he would react to us. And when I came down the plane, he was there at the airport. And then I drove in with him. And you know, outside Moscow, you have these iron girders like a cross. To be at St. Paul's, either which way, I've forgotten. I think it was something. He went up and he only started to paint when he was 80.
Got a bit closer.
You see that? That's cardboard. And he was a primitive painter, and he had a profound influence on Harold Nicholson, a great painter, also on a sculptress who was Harold Nicholson's wife, Barbara Hepworth. So one little man, and you can see his writing here. This is mid-ocean, and the paintings, and lighthouses. And there's his name, Alfred Wallace, written. He was probably 85.
Yes,
From the West Country, from Plymouth.
Okay, about these photos, is Uzbek national
This is
dress.
my grandchildren, all dressed up like Indians for Thanksgiving Day, which in America, my wife is American, so this house.
Oh, your wife is American.
This house celebrates the independence of America and Thanksgiving Day, which Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, said this will be the day we'll celebrate as a country. This is me, and this is an Uzbek coat. It was given to me by Elisha Osmanov, who remains a friend of mine, though I no longer do business. I'm retired. And this is my little sailing boat, here and there, in Greece. I've never been without a boat since the age of 6. Now I'm finding it a little harder to manage, but I keep it. And I have a house in Greece, and I get away and sail whenever I can and fish.
Oh, nice.
This is the River Thames, and we're in the East End of London, which is the poor end of London. I've lived here since 1965, and I bought that part of the house, because there are two houses mixed together, that one over there, for £3,000 in 1965.
Oh, really?
I was a young hospital
Nice.
doctor. God knows how many. It probably cost 3 million now.
3 million.
And next door to me is the actor Ian McKellen. And if you look out there,
Who?
Ian McKellen
Ian
is a
McKellen.
Shakespearean actor,
Okay.
and he lives in this house and the next one. And then in the river there, you'd have to go outside and see it, is a Gormley statue, one of our famous sculptures, which are in iron, men cast in iron. Not that, that's not a Gormley.
Yeah, I understand.
But the one in the river is a Gormley.
How old is Ian this actor?
I don't know who's the sculpture. It's, Ian McKellen owns it. I don't know who he is. It's quite striking. We like it. But it's the most beautiful part of the Thames. You're on this great big U, and that's down there, and then you look there, you see the skyscraper above it, and that's Canary Wharf, which is really the new city of London.
Canary Wharf, yeah. Always windy there.
Greenwich is down there. Then if docks, when I first came here, there were none of those houses. That big building there was there, but it was docks, and you can see there, you go in there, that was an old dock, and these were called the Surrey Docks.
Dockland.
Now, all the docks are at the mouth of the Thames.
Favorite here.
Well, this is one of my, which is, he was my boss when he was Minister of Defence and I was in the Navy.
Okay.
And when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer when I was Foreign Secretary. And we had a wonderful friendship, but also a great deal. And here he is. So my wife says I'm not allowed to put this out on the, but for the children to see. But that is the famous side. That is the man. That's
No, we have in Russia like this one more.
This is a real Democrat, solid Labour guy, very academic, but a man of the people. And he was my friend. And I like this book. And I sometimes turn it round like that. And I come in, and then you look at that picture and you just smile.
He's not alive now.
He's not alive now, no, Dennis. He was never leader of the Labour Party, like me. He should have been, but there we are. That's a good book. This is, of course, a good book of Robert Caro on LBJ. And talk about the deal maker. Trump isn't the deal maker. The deal maker in chief was him. He came from Texas, and he's the one who carried through after Kennedy's death the rights for the blacks and voting, and great, couldn't have come from a leader other than him. He was a failure really as a president, but for what he did for civil rights makes him, of course, an interesting figure.
Could you open some book for me, please?
Well, I think I should open my own book.
Oh, yeah.
Two. One is called In
Sickness
Sickness and Power, and the other one is The Balkans, Balkan Odyssey.
Show me both again, please. Yeah.
Well, this is when in the Balkans, hard labour from 1992 to 1995.
Open it,
And I worked with the UN, of course, very strongly.
Some photos inside? Any photos? No? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great man, Cyrus Vance. He and I worked together. He was American Secretary of State. I knew him when we dealt with Africa in the 70s. We worked together in the Balkans in the 90s. A great American. He resigned from President Carter's administration actually over the helicopter raid on Iran to remove the hostages, to get the American hostages. It was a disaster, and the helicopters blew up in the sand, and the whole enterprise. He just knew as a former Secretary of Defense and Army that it wouldn't work. He's a great man. Very great American. This is a thing called Private Eye, and so it's Yugoslavia latest. And the thing is, I'm afraid it's a lost cause, and there's me saying, I'm your man. Yeah. You've got to be able to laugh about politics. It's a haphazard business. And that's the serious side, that's a sniper. last night, all this ethnic cleansing and the damaging of the houses and the stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a book, In Sickness and in Power, and it's a book about, here's a man dying, King Arthur, and it's about how illness affects politicians, and then they start making very bad decisions.
Yeah.
And it's to try to say, alert people to the dangers of power, and power itself produces a hubris in people. They lose their sense of humour if they ever had one. They think they themselves are all-powerful, and they do a lot of damage, and we have to be careful about these people.
Almost everyone, yeah, who is spent a lot of years.
Yes, you're all at risk for it. I sometimes say, when I write about hubris,